right, if there are no questions, then we will start today's lecture. Sorry. All right, so let's go over today. Today we'll discuss chapter 2. So just a quick kind of observations from chapter 1 before we move forward. A lot of times what I see students struggle with is, you'll also struggle with it in this chapter, is distinguishing between what's a cost and what's a benefit. So if I ask just for cost, then don't include benefits. So for an example, the cost of studying an hour for an economics test. The cost would have been I could have spent that hour enjoying a movie. The benefit is I might do better on my economics test. So please make sure you properly distinguish between a cost and a benefit. So if I asked you the cost of studying an hour for the economics test, do not give me both the cost and the benefit. Give me just the cost. A lot of times students, especially in multiple choice, they see both of them there, so they pick both of them. Also remember the difference between efficiency and equality. Remember, efficiency is getting a bigger pie. Equality is making sure the pie is cut equally and that there's a trade-off. Just a couple of quick reminders. I don't take late material. I know I've said that. I will, if you send me an email, I will apologize that something happened, but I give you 2 free homeworks and 2 free quizzes to miss for whatever reasons. They're all valid to me, and it's not fair for me to try to judge whose reasons are better than somebody else's. So they're all equivalent. So you get 2 missed quizzes and 2 missed homeworks throughout the semester. That's just the way it'll operate. I won't extend quizzes. It's not fair because somebody had to give up. There was a cost to take the quiz for somebody, and they may not have liked the cost they pay, and I'm not going to diminish that. I will always help you out. All graded material for a chapter is located under each chapter in Blackboard. So right now we're in Module 1 for the Test 1. After we take Test 1, we'll move to Module 2. After we take Test 2, we move to Module 3. I don't think this is a problem. I took them, I think, all out of Examity, but you should only take Test 1, Test 2, Test 3, and the final exam on Examity. Don't take any quizzes on there. Don't take any practice tests. Just take those. In Blackboard, they don't allow me to call things quizzes. The only option I have is to call them a test. In reality, they're quizzes. So quizzes, you must use Respondus Lockdown Browser. Okay, so you have to download that to take the quiz. If you download Respondus Lockdown Browser, you don't need a password. The password is really to force you to use that browser. All right, so a question I have, again, students, if you have any questions during the semester on homework quizzes, please feel free to send them to me. A lot of times I'll use them in class. I won't say who sent me the question, it doesn't matter. But I figure if someone sends me a question, they probably have other students who have this exact same question. So here's a question from the quiz, and it's going to deal with marginal cost and marginal benefit. So the question asks, suppose the cost of flying a 200-seat plane for an airplane is $100,000, and there are 10 empty seats on the flight. If the marginal cost of flying a passenger is $200 and a standby passenger is willing to pay $300, what should the airline do? So some of you look at this problem and you went, oh, here's what I do. I take 100,000, I divide it by 200, and that comes to 500. So the average cost for a seat is $500. So if someone's willing to pay me $300, and the average cost is $500, I shouldn't sell them the ticket. That is not the way to think of this problem. This doesn't matter. The only information we care about are these three pieces. So what I should look at is the airplane has empty seats. It's about to fly, and I have somebody there willing to pay me $300 for that empty seat. Well, they're willing to pay me $300. If I let them on the plane as an airline, it's going to cost me $200. That means $200 of soda, food, extra gas, whatever the airline has determined is the extra cost of servicing this passenger. So if I add them onto the plane, today it's just going to cost me an extra $200. However, the customer is going to pay me $300. So at the last minute, I will sell it to the standby person because the airline makes, or the way to look at it is gets an extra $100. If they told the passenger no, the airline would get $0. And it would still be out at other cost. So when we think about the margin, as we think about what does it cost for one more? Now, for the long term, if the airline can't sell all its tickets, it's going to lose money, even if it does let a bunch of standby people on, because it's not going to cover their long run cost. This is more of a micro question. You'll get into more details if you take microeconomics about this and a lot more discussion about it. But here we just want to focus on the marginal part, looking at marginal cost and marginal benefit, marginal cost. And if the benefit's more than the cost, we sell them the ticket. Correct. Now, yeah, you sell. All right. Are there any other questions about that? All right. Then we're going to move on to chapter 2. So chapter 2, I've dubbed it kind of thinking like an economist. So chapter 2 is kind of going to give you kind of a background of how economists look at the world and kind of what we are and where we fit in this world. So we're going to talk about what an economist's roles are, how they differ. And we're going to talk about models and how do we use them. We're going to talk about the circular flow diagram and the concepts this diagram illustrates. And we're going to talk about PPF curves and how they relate to opportunity cost. What other concepts we get from production's possibilities frontiers. You should look at the difference between micro and macro and between positive and normative. I won't cover that today. That's pretty simple. You can read in the book about that, or you can look over the full slides to see that. I just don't have time to cover that in class. So when we talk about an economist has kind of two roles. One role is we're a scientist. Because what we're trying to do is explain the world. We're trying to explain how the world works. A lot of times people don't like our explanations because they just don't like it. They said it's kind of like gravity. I don't really like gravity. It makes me weigh too much. If I were on the moon, gravity's less, I wouldn't weigh as much. Just because I don't like the outcome doesn't mean that's not how the world works. People a lot of times with economics think that way, and they look at our views and our theories that way, and it's sometimes a little frustrating. We try to be much like all scientists. We try to impose the scientific method. And second, is sometimes we conflate the two roles, and we're trying to be policy advisors. Sometimes we're trying to use our science to try to improve the world. Okay? However, this also comes with some biases. Okay? As economists, we're not just like everybody else. We look at things like efficiency and equality, and we might weigh them differently than other people. And so there is some bias here, but you should recognize as economists, as policy advisors, when we're trying to explain how the world should be, we're bringing our own ideas about values. A good economist will tell you the cost and benefits and let you see what we believe the benefits are and the cost. So you can see what the policy will bring, and you can weigh the cost and benefits yourself. Okay. Our role as scientists is kind of to identify cost and benefits, and sometimes as policy advisors, we try to act on these cost and benefits we find to explain the world. So as scientists, we employ the scientific method. That's a dispassionate, unbiased development and testing of how theories work and how the world works. Just like any other scientist, we have to make assumptions. Assumptions are very simple. We try to simplify a complex world and make it easier to understand. Probably the two biggest assumptions in economics are people act rationally and self-interested. Now, does that mean they're always rational and everyone's always self-interested? No, we understand that. But we have to come up with some idea about how the world's going to work. And we find that most of the time people are rational, or they attempt to be rational. We look at cost and benefits and we say, oh, the benefit of that outweighs the cost, we should do it. Doesn't mean that always happens. Sometimes we get confused and we don't always know what the cost and benefits are, and we make decisions that, looking back, we kind of think of them as silly. It happens to everyone, even economists. Sometimes we misjudge cost and benefits, and we quite don't understand how the world's going to work with that. And sometimes we overestimate or hope for things that really aren't rational. A lot of times, economists have studied this in the world of subscriptions. And the one we probably look most at is gym memberships. Now, hopefully no one on campus has a gym membership, as you can use the student center here. I guess they call it the Recreation and Wellness Center for free. So you don't necessarily need a gym membership, but doesn't mean everyone doesn't have one. And one of the irrational parts we look at with a gym membership is that I know I don't like to work out, but somehow I think if I spend this money on buying a gym membership, that all of a sudden I'm going to go to the gym a whole lot more. I don't like going to the gym to start with. Just because I buy the membership isn't going to make me necessarily go. But a lot of times we find sometimes we're irrational on things we hope for. I hope to lose more weight, so I hope to go to the gym more. Doesn't mean those two things always equal out. And there are some economists who look at where we're not rational and why we're not always rational. But for the most part, we assume people to be rational. Over time, I'll cancel my gym membership because I know I'm not going to go. But it may take me a while before I end up rational. And second is we're self-interested. We care about ourselves. How do I know that? Well, you're self-interested. Nobody goes around just handing out their money. I don't see anybody just taking their $10 and just handing them to random people down the street. Or better yet, just taking their money and dumping it on the street so that way they don't know who gets it. Why? Because I care about my resources, my money, my time, who I give it to, who I don't. And what I do with my life is that I'm trying to make myself happy. And that may be through a variety of ways that I do that. But I'm doing it to make the world I want and the world I want it to be. It doesn't mean I'm purely greedy, but I'm pretty close. We all are. It doesn't mean the world has to be a bad place because we're greedy. Greed can also be used to benefit, right? If we think about really what a business owner does, business owners are greedy. They want to make money for themselves. But in order to be a good business owner, I have to serve other people. I have to make them happy. So they're kind of the greed is good. Even though I care about making myself happy, in order for that to occur, I have to make others happy. And then part of the goal as society is to try to tame some of that. As well, you can't trick people. We want to make sure it's done with limits. Second part, we use models. Just like they use models in science class, we're going to use them in economics. It's just a simplified representation. It's how we're going to try to explain the world. The world's very complicated, but we're going to try to break it down into simple models. And as the semester goes along, we're going to start with as simple models as we can. So today we're going to start with the simplest models almost possible to explain the world. As the semester goes along, our models become more complex. So the goal behind a principles class is we're going to try to start with very, very simple models, and we're going to try to build on them a little bit. We're not going to be able to explain perfectly everything that happens in the world in a principles class, but the goal is for you to leave here having kind of an understanding of the world, an understanding of how things work. So the first model we're going to use is probably one of the simplest ones. Okay? If you took economics in high school, this is your model. And I refer to it as a high school model. And if you were to take economics in high school, you'd probably spend a day and a half on this. We're going to spend 10 minutes. What is the circular flow diagram? Very simple. It's a visual model of how the economy works. What it does is it shows how dollars flow through the markets as well as goods and services. So we're going to talk about kind of how the world works in a very simple model. In our model, there are two decision makers, firms and households. So we have businesses and we have people. And these two decision makers interact in two markets. The markets for goods, should be goods, sorry, typo. So we have goods and services, and we have factors of production. And what are factors of production? Well, factors of production are, hopefully if you've taken foundations, you'll learn this. If you have not, it's very simple. Factors of production. Are the three big ones: land, labor, capital, and the fourth one is entrepreneurship. So let's talk about these factors of production. Labor, most people get labor. That's people working. That's my work. That's my time I give to a business. Land, that's anything from the earth. Capital, in this class, you see the word capital. Do not think of money. That is not the right way to think of capital. Now, this isn't the proper definition, but I would call it Dr. Walscheid's definition. The definition of capital is stuff that's used to make other stuff or services. So in order for something to be capital, it has to be physical. It has to be something I can touch. So think about capital as something I can touch and make and use to make something. So money is not capital, right? If I give you money, you can't make anything with money. I guess if you're into origami, you can make an origami swan. But for the most part, there isn't anything money can make. What money can make is if you buy capital, and that's what makes stuff. So I need to buy stuff. So the stuff is what actually makes other stuff. Not money, but capital. So capital is what I use to make other stuff. And then finally, households provide entrepreneurship. What is entrepreneurship? is I come up with an idea of how to use land, labor, and capital. So I have an idea. So think about entrepreneurship. It's really an idea. Is I have an idea of how to create a business. Well, how do I create a business? Well, how I create a business is I use land, labor, capital, and I use that to produce a product. So it's an input into the factors of production. As I'm coming up with ideas about how to use the other factors. So I come up with ideas about how to use land, labor, and capital. So that's a good. So the reds represent, think about them as goods or service. So the red is as households I provide land, labor, capital. So firms take this land, labor, and capital, and what they do with my land, labor, and capital is they produce goods. And what they do with those goods is they send them to the market. And in the market, as households, I buy these goods. So what I do as a household is I provide my labor to a business. And when I provide my labor, what do I get for my labor? Are goods and services. So how does money play a role? Well, money is just how we keep track. So the more labor I provide, the more income I get as a household. And my income is something called a wage. So if I provide labor, I get paid wages. And I use these wages to buy goods and services. So in reality, as a household, I work so I can get goods and services. I don't work for money. Money is nice, but really all I want with the money is to get goods and services. I just want to use my money so I can get goods and services. So money isn't all be all. It's the labor we use makes us get goods and services. The green line is just the money, the outside. It's how we keep track. It's how we count things. It's just easier to count it in money than it is in oranges or apples. So think about money kind of as a way to count. It's our numbering system in economics. And we have special names for money based on what it's used for. So if I pay someone to work for me, it's a wage. If I pay someone to use their land or capital, we refer to that as a rent. And profits are what I pay to entrepreneurs. That's how an entrepreneur gets paid. He gets paid in profits. She gets paid in profits. So is the circular flow diagram perfect? Does it do a perfect job of explaining how the world works? No, it doesn't. It's not perfect. It's missing things. So what's it missing? Well, it could be missing another player. It could be missing something like the government. So if I put the government here as a player, so we'll put a little rectangle, hold it the government, well, what would it look like? Probably got its probably like this, right? It's interacting with everybody. Right. So the government could be a role. We could have other markets. We'll talk about later. We'll call it the market for financial products. How does banking work in this system? So this is the very simplest model. Households provide land, labor, capital. Firms use that land, labor, capital to make goods and services, which are then bought by the households. And money is just how we're keeping track of it. So it's a very simple explanation of how the world works. And what we're going to do from there is move forward and move into either focusing on specific parts of this or expanding kind of the circular flow as we go along. First part, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about something called the PPF. If you look online, because a lot of students do, it's also sometimes called the PPC, the Productions Possibilities Curve. I have a bad tendency, and I apologize, is I shouldn't call it, but I'll sometimes call it the PPF curve, which is not quite correct. The problem is, as a student, when I grew up, I called it the PPC. As an instructor, now the new proper term is the PPF. So sometimes I intermix them, and I'm sorry. I try not to. I almost always say the PPF, and just sometimes I add the word curve. That's incorrect. But usually on the test, I'm correct. But when I talk and trying to explain something, my brain kind of goes a little faster than my mouth. So sometimes I add words I don't need to add, and I apologize. But we always need to work on production's possibilities frontier, the PPF. So what is the PPF? Well, the PPF really is going to explain this market for the factors of production. So the PPF looks at this market for the factors of production. And we're going to talk about what an economy can produce. So given factors of production and a level of technology, how we use these factors, we can talk about how much an economy can produce, and how much it will produce, but how much it can produce. We're just going to talk about how able is it to do, and what can it produce. So the example we're going to start in class is we're going to start with a simple graph or simple model. The assumptions. Assumption 1. We're going to start with 2 goods, computers and wheat. Why 2 goods? Because 2 goods makes it a 2-dimensional graph. We could expand it to lots of goods. But the problem is, if I expand it to lots of goods, what happens is that we kind of can't graph it. And because we can't graph it, then it doesn't make it as simple. So we're going to stay with 2 goods to make life easier. Second thing, just 1 factor of production. We're just going to use labor. Again, it makes the world easier. We can expand it to other factors, and we'll kind of hint at other factors, but we're just going to use labor. And what we're going to do is we're going to measure it in hours. So what we have in this economy is people who can work, and they can work for 50,000 labor hours. So we have enough people that they can put in 50,000 hours of work each month. Of course, ignore that other one. Oh, sorry, I changed my goods. I do that all the time. Apologize. In class, I don't. When I do it on my slides, I sometimes change the goods. It doesn't matter what 2 goods we have. We're going to stay with our same goods that we had before. But here we're just... So we're going to change from computers. All of a sudden, they're magically going to become airplanes, and wheat's going to become soybeans. But everything else stays the same. I need to change that slide. I apologize. So we still have a fixed amount of resources, labor, and technology doesn't change. So based on our resources, what we're going to find is the endpoints. As an economy, I can produce 5,000 tons of soybeans if all I do is produce soybeans. Okay, so this is an endpoint. If I do nothing but produce airplanes, I create another endpoint. So here's endpoint 1, here's endpoint 2. Or we can be some combination between. So here's kind of what an output table would look like. So based on a variety of combinations, if I produce A, no airplanes, 5,000 soybeans. If I produce B, 20 airplanes, 4,000 soybeans. So the question I like to ask from here is, what's the opportunity cost? So what is the cost to move from A to B? So what does it cost me to move from point A to point B? What do I give up? So the cost is in soybeans because that's what I have less of. So in order to move from point A to point B, is I'm going to give up something, and I'm going to give up here soybeans. So the cost is 1,000 soybeans. And the benefit is 20 airplanes. But we're focusing on the cost. The cost is soybeans. So if I ask cost, don't give me the benefit, only the cost. The cost here is soybeans. So we have this thing. What we can do is we can draw our graph. So what we want to do when we draw a graph is we go to the endpoints, start at the endpoints. So here's point A. On the x-axis, if this was kind of math class. Do it on the y, that would be the y-axis. And then we plot from there, and then we draw a line to connect the dots. So what we learned from this production possibilities frontier is we learned three things. We can talk about what's efficient, what's inefficient, and what's not feasible. So the goal of a production possibilities frontier curve, sorry, I'll just do that. Goal of production's possibilities frontier is we want to be on this line. This is the efficiency line. So as a country, we don't care what point we're on as long as we're on this line. So no point is better than the other. So A is not better than B, B is not better than C, C is not better than D, D is not better than E. They're all equivalent. They're all efficient. If we are inside the curve, we refer to this as inefficient. We can produce here. There's nothing stopping us from producing at point F. So we call it possible. It's just a bad idea. And because it's inefficient, what it means by inefficient is that I don't actually have to give up something to move to the efficiency point. Because I have stuff, or I have people not doing anything. They're just sitting around. So if I employ them, there's no cost to that because we can move to the efficiency line. So they're just kind of sitting there idle, kind of like a machine. And the machine just works. It doesn't need anything to work. It's just there, so it's inefficient. And because it's inefficient, just increasing production, say going from F to C, actually doesn't come at a cost. It's one of the few things that doesn't have a cost. So it's one of those questions I get to. So what is something that is not feasible? Anything out here we can't get to. So if we're at point G, that's not feasible today. So we can't get to point G. So here's kind of the two examples. So point F, I did a little backwards. So we would go to 80 and 4,000, which we would plot right here. And we quickly figure out that's not possible. Point G, 30, 2,500. We would plot here. And we would see that it's possible but not efficient. So there's a couple of different ways I could ask this question. I could ask the question by giving you the information such as 80 and 4,000 and say, is that possible? Is it not possible? Is it efficient? Or I could give you such things and say, well, what about point F? How would you describe point F? And if you would describe point F, you would describe it as not possible. So these are kind of things that I would ask concerning production's possibilities curves and how it would work. So what you should be able to point out at any curve on the PPF, what's possible, what's efficient, what's not possible, what's not efficient. So let's talk about the PPF and let's talk about moving along the points. If I move along this curve, what's happening is I'm shifting resources from one good to another. So what I'm doing is, if I'm going from point E to point D, I'm giving up airplanes to move to soybeans. So what is the opportunity cost then of one airplane? Well, the cost of 20 airplanes is 1,000 soybeans. So the cost then of one airplane here is, oops, oh, the answer was there. Right, so we can find out what the opportunity cost of 20 airplanes is. And we find that to be 1,000. So how we're going to solve for one airplane here is we would just divide each side by 20. Now what's the opportunity cost of one soybean? So let's start here at point A, and I would move to point B. Since it's a line, all it is I'm going to take the 1,000 soybeans equals 20 airplanes. That's the cost. So what I want to do is I want to find what one soybean is, so I would just simply divide by 1,000. So that gets me one soybean and 1/50th of an airplane. So with a straight line, finding opportunity cost is easy, right? As I can find what the cost of one airplane is because it's simply linear. If you learn anything about linear, it's a slope, and the slope is constant. So then I can find the opportunity cost relatively easy. So how do I get my curve to move? Well, how do I get economic growth? Well, I get economic growth through two ways. Additional resources or an improvement in technology. So what do I get is I find more factors of production. So one way to get more production is to have more people, to have more capital, to have more land. That is one way for an economy to grow. If you go back and you study history, most wars were fought over trying to get more land. Why did they want more land? Well, they wanted more land so they could have more economic growth. And the way they did it is they did it through additional factors of production. So if you go back and you're a purveyor of history, you go back and you look at wars. Most wars were fought over additional resources. Is I wanted to have access to more factors of production. And what they did is they took over land. We do that a little bit today, but not nearly as much do we have wars over trying to take over more land. That was a very destructive way of trying to increase economic growth. What we do more today doesn't mean it doesn't happen with economic growth. There are some examples today of it happening, but mostly today of economic growth as we focus on the second part, improvement in technology. As we try to come up with better ideas as a way to grow the economy. And if I can come up with better ideas, I can get more economic growth. So there's two types of technology shifts. Sorry. There are two types of technology shifts. This one is referred to as a general shift. With a general shift, that means I got better at both goods. I became more productive overall, as I found ways to make more of everything. Another way to do it is through what we call a sector shift. And a sector shift involves me only getting better at making one good. So an example of a sector shift would be all of a sudden I get better at making so let's say I got better just at making wheat. So I came up with a new seed that improved my wheat production. So what would happen is we don't get the full change. Computers still remain the same. I didn't get any better at making computers. However, my new seed allowed me to grow wheat more efficiently. And so what happens is my wheat endpoint changed. My computer one did not. And now when I draw my new curve, the curve rotates. So a general one shifts the curve. A sector one rotates it. So if I become better at making just one good, that rotates my curve. If I become better at making both goods, that shifts my curve. So what are some examples of things that shift the curves? Well, things like cell phones, computers, that allowed us to become better at making all kinds of goods and services. The internet. Now, if we think about sector, that's things that just affect that area. So I came up with as I said, like a new seed for wheat, better fertilizer. If I have better fertilizer, that's not going to affect my endpoint of computers. It allows us to get more computers in the economy because I may not have to devote as many resources to wheat as I did before. But the endpoint doesn't change. So if one of the endpoints doesn't change, that's referred to as a sector shift. If both endpoints change, that's a general technology change. All factor production leads to general changes. Technology changes in certain sectors give us the rotation. The shape of the PPF depends on the assumption we make. If we assume very simple world, that would be a constant opportunity cost. This is the simplest of worlds. This is what we'll do in chapter 3. Most of the time, the examples I'm going to use in chapter 2 are more realistic. And because they're more realistic, it makes the curve a little more difficult to analyze, at least mathematically. Because what we have here is a bowed curve. And something that is bowed means it's increasing opportunity cost. So here, it was always one airplane, 50 soybeans. With this one, it might start off as one airplane for 20 soybeans, but as we move along the curve, the costs change. We might end up at a point where it's one airplane for 100 soybeans because it's a curve rather than a straight line. So here's the example. It uses beer and mountain bikes. So as the economy shifts resources, as we go from making less beer to more mountain bikes, the cost increases because it becomes steeper. Now, the way we find the opportunity cost is always the same. It is always going to be based on the slope of the PPF. Now, the slope of the PPF of a curve, you learn from calculus as you take the first derivative. But we're not going to have to do that because all I'm going to ask are straight lines. I might ask a curve, but if I ask a curve, it's going to be simple. So if I ask a curve, it's going to be something simple as follows. So what is the cost to move from point A to point B? And you would tell me 20 beer. Or I could ask you, what's the opportunity cost to move from point B to D? And you would go, well, the cost here then is 30 beer. So as we move along the curve, it costs us more to make another mountain bike. So for here to make one mountain bike, it only cost me 20 beer. Here, it cost me 30 beer. And if I were to continue to do this, it always cost me more and more beer to produce more and more mountain bikes. Why is that? If we look at it from labor, because all of us are different. Some of us are better at making mountain bikes than we are at beer. And because we have different skills, we change fields at a different rate. The people who change fields first from beer to mountain bikes are the people who are really good at mountain bikes, but really bad at making beer. So if they left the beer line, we don't notice them gone because the output doesn't decrease. As we make more and more mountain bikes, there's less and less people available, so I have to start pulling better and better beer people away. And pulling better and better beer people away has a greater and greater cost in the beer industry. So in reality, since we're all different, the Bode curve makes more sense. The problem is, to analyze the Bode curve, we would need higher level of mathematics. We're not going to use that. We're going to use very simple, what I call 8th grade math. We're going to use lines. Unless, as I said, unless it's going to be a simple question like that I give you the answer. You can solve it without needing calculus. You can solve it through algebra. And there are different opportunity costs. If you're into farmland, there's different types of land suited for different types of uses. So because the world is different, we don't have this constant opportunity cost. Now, we assume constant opportunity cost most of the time in this class because it makes analysis easier. But we know that assumption is just simplifying the world. We can't expand it to more complex ideas. It just makes the math more difficult and doesn't change our outcome. So we're going to say with the simple part. A couple more things to talk about before we go, because I have a couple more minutes. Oftentimes you pay attention, especially now, as you see sometimes we give conflicting policy advice. why that is we can disagree about some of the ideas or some of the assumptions. And also we have different values. Right? Some economists value equality more than efficiency, just like people. We're people too. So we all don't have the same views of the world or values. And some of us value things differently. However, there are lots of things we do agree on, not even perfectly 100%. But for example, we find, we'll talk about this, rent control reduces quantity and quality of housing available. Tariffs and quotas are usually a bad idea for economic welfare. We'll talk about that next chapter. Outsourcing is a way to grow the economy. But again, it comes at some cost. Agricultural subsidies, not necessarily good ideas. Shouldn't give subsidies to sports franchises. We shouldn't help them build their own stadiums. Better to give people cash than to give them goods. Again, we may not like that. Large federal budget deficit has an adverse effect. Shouldn't ban GMO crops. Minimum wage hurts young and unskilled workers. We shouldn't be subsidizing ethanol. So there are lots of things economists do agree on at some level of agreement, again, but we'll never be perfect because we're different. Just because we know what will happen, and what we're going to do a lot in this class is we're going to talk about kind of the science part of it, not a lot about the policy part. We're going to talk a lot about the science part, about what happens. And then based on what happens is we can make our decisions from there. As always, I try to end each chapter with kind of some summaries about what to make. Here's macro and micro. Here's kind of economist as scientist. Here's positive and normative. You'll need that for your quiz. And we talk about why we give conflicting advice. All right, are there any questions about that? All right, if there are no questions, we have a homework due today. Quiz we'll do on Friday. If you've looked forward to next week, we're going to start chapter 3. Chapter 3 is going to have 3 quizzes. The first quiz will be kind of definitional parts. Will be kind of looking at the theories behind chapter 3. Quiz B and C for at least chapter 3 will be a math part. So we will actually be working problems in chapter 3. So chapter 3, we're going to do a little bit of mathematics. Not a lot, but we're going to talk about kind of math and how to solve some trade problems and how that demonstrates the benefit of trade. So chapter 3 is going to have 3 quizzes. If you quickly can figure out the number of quizzes for a chapter is going to tell you how important it is and will be proportional to how many questions will be on the test. So chapters 1 and 2 each had 1 quiz. So chapter 3 has 3 quizzes. So chapter 3 is going to be a bigger part of your test than chapter 1 and 2. And then chapter 4 has 3 quizzes and chapter 6 has 1 quiz. So it kind of also will tell you what's important for each set of modules. Not all chapters are equal. Some are more equal. So we're going to spend more time on chapters that are more important. So next week, we're going to talk about chapter 3. Following week will be chapter 4. The 5th week will be chapter 6. And then we will have a test. So in this class, it's always 5 weeks, then a test. So please try to keep up. Probably the easiest way to keep up is if it's Monday, Wednesday, or Friday, something is due. So if it's Wednesday, something is due today. So you went through a Wednesday and you didn't turn anything in for this class, you missed it. It's not to be mean, I just hopefully try to get in your head, it's Wednesday, I should be doing econ. And find what you need to be doing with econ. On Blackboard, I have put up the calendar for this class, and it tells you what is due. So if you look at the calendar today, it does say chapter 2 homework. So please utilize the calendar in Blackboard, or create your own. My suggestion is every week I would write down, starting from Sunday to Saturday, and I would write down what is due on each day. I don't know how each online class is set up. Each class is set up with things due a different day. I want you to be engaged in this class all week, so I have things due all week, rather than just cramming them all on one day. Because I want you to be working, because it's good habit. If you're in a good habit of working econ each day, you'll find this class a lot easier than trying to cram everything at the last minute. So I try to create a system where you do that, and hopefully that works out better for you. So please try to take advantage of that. As I said,
Is the work?
Go ahead, Parker. Sorry, go ahead, Parker.
Is the work on Cengage?
Yes,
Right.
It'll be on Cengage tonight, but you can always link through it to Blackboard. So if you go with Blackboard, it should say Chapter 2 homework. You click on it, it should take you exactly to Chapter 2 homework. Or at least that's the way they told me it was set up.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Other questions? All right, if not,